Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Rethinking Martin and Malcolm, an online professional development seminar from the National Humanities Center. I'm Richard Schramm, Vice President for Education Programs here at the Center, and I'll be moderating the session this evening. Before we get underway, let me take just a minute to introduce the National Humanities Center to you. We're located in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina, tucked in among the cities of Raleigh, Durham, and Chapel Hill. The center is the country's only independent institute for advanced study in all branches of the humanities. It's a real mouthful, so let me see if I can deconstruct that for you a bit. First of all, we're independent. That means we're a private nonprofit organization. We're an institute for advanced study, which means that the major program we do here is a fellowship program that brings scholars from this country and around the world to the center for an academic year to research and write books and articles in the humanities: history, literature and language study, philosophy, criticism of the arts, subjects like that. We opened in 1978, and since then, over 1,100 scholars have worked here, and they have produced over 1,200 books. The place may sound like an ivory tower, and it looks like one, but the founders didn't want it to be an ivory tower. They wanted it to connect with a wide variety of audiences, and they were particularly interested in connecting with teachers. These days, we do that in three ways: our online seminars, which you've discovered. We still have a few more seminars left, and we still have some openings in them. So if you'd like to sign up for those, check our website. They are filling up, however. We also connect with teachers through TeacherServe, which is a collection of 3 instructional guides that consist of secondary sources, essays written by leading scholars that illuminate important topics in 3 areas of U.S. history: religion, the environment, and African American culture. These essays also offer advice on how to teach these topics. You may be particularly interested in one of our TeacherServe guides, Freedom Story, which contains material on the civil rights movement and other topics in African American literature and history. In addition, we offer our Toolbox Library. These are collections of primary documents. They're teaching anthologies. They are arranged chronologically, and then within those chronological frames, they are established thematically. They offer not only primary documents, but notes that contextualize and illuminate the documents, along with a series of discussion questions. They are really ideal for classroom instruction. I would like to tell you about our newest toolbox, Making the Revolution, America, 1763 to 1791. It will have nearly 150 items in it, and many of these items are new to the web. It will consist of sermons, broadsides, poems, stories, maps, images, all sorts of things about the revolution, and it will be available in a few weeks next month. So please, when you get a chance, take a look at that, Making the Revolution, our newest toolbox. Now, we have a Facebook page. Please become a friend of the National Humanities Center, and in that way you'll learn about all of the new developments here in the education programs. Let me tell you that tonight's seminar will be recorded, and you will be able to get access to that recording through the same website through which you obtained the text for the seminar. You will also find there a copy of the PowerPoint, and we invite you to use the PowerPoint, plunder it for your classroom instruction. That's what it's there for. Feel free to take the slides and use them in your classes. You will also find on the site an evaluation, and we really ask you to fill that evaluation out and submit it to us. It's very important, and we pay attention to what you tell us in an effort to improve these programs. Now, you will receive from us documentation of participation. This will be a letter that we will send you testifying to the fact that you participated in the seminar, and that you can present that to your local certifying authority to get whatever recertification credit your participation warrants. How do you participate? Well, if you want to raise your hand and ask a question or make a comment, you can click on the little hand raised icon right there. I will see it because it will appear next to your name right up there, and at an appropriate moment, I will pass the microphone icon to you. Right now, your microphone icon is red. When your microphone is on, it will be green, like the one next to my name there, and then you can hold forth with your question or comment. If you prefer not to use the microphone, you can put your cursor in the chat box down at the bottom right-hand side of your screen, type your message, click send, and your message will appear in the chat box above. I will be moderating the chat. I'll be paying attention to it throughout the entire evening, and I will bring the chat into the conversation at appropriate moments. Are there any questions before we get underway? If we're ready to go, everybody send me a little smiley face to let me know that we're ready. You see the smiley face icon there. There they go. Wonderful. Okay, so I guess we're ready to plunge ahead to learn about Martin and Malcolm. Our goals this evening are quite simple. We want to deepen your understanding of the civil rights movement and the black freedom struggle as represented by Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. We want to compare and contrast the objectives and strategies pursued by King and Malcolm X and rethink their relationship to each other. And we want to introduce you to primary sources that you can use in your teaching. Now, as you know, we post a forum before all of our seminars, and this forum had a lot of comments. We gleaned six major themes. Students are often asked which man they would follow and why as a teaching strategy. Some of you wanted to know, how did African Americans respond to the assassination of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr.? Students find it difficult to relate to Malcolm X and the idea of black nationalism and black power movements. Often they don't like Malcolm X and are unsympathetic to his ideas and motives. Perhaps they have been drilled to believe that Martin Luther King's way was the right way. So we ask, how can we dispel the negative connotations that often accompany the message of Malcolm X? How did Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. relate to other civil rights leaders like Stokely Carmichael? Did King become more militant in his thinking, and did Malcolm X become less so as the 60s progressed? And finally, what myths and falsehood distort our perceptions of King and Malcolm X? To lead us through a discussion of those and other topics tonight, we're pleased to have with us Stephen F. Lawson, who was a fellow of the National Humanities Center in 1987 and 88. He is Professor Emeritus of History at Rutgers University, where his area of research is the history of the Civil Rights Movement. And you can see some of his publications there. We couldn't get them all on this one slide. So now, ladies and gentlemen, let me turn the program over to Steve. Steve, it is all yours. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Richard. I hope everyone can hear me. I'm speaking to you from Jersey, a touch of New Jersey, which is basically the central part of the state, but not too far from Rutgers University, where I taught from 1998 until 2009. I'm very pleased to be able to do this webinar, I guess you'd call it. I've done quite a number of these, but not on the web. I'm usually speaking directly to teachers, and find that in some ways less intimidating than looking at this screen. I hope all of you can hear me. It looked like on the chat box there's something about some of you are having trouble. But
yes, some of us are having some trouble. Two things. If you could first maybe move the microphone closer to your mouth, and then up at the upper left-hand side of your screen where you see audio.
Audio.
It's
yeah.
File, Edit, Share, Audio. Click on that, and you'll see the third item. It says Integrated VoIP.
Uh-huh.
Volume, yeah. Click on that and move the volume of your microphone up all the way.
Well, it is all the way.
Okay. Well, maybe, yeah, we're getting...
all the way.
Okay.
It looks like we're getting the green parts are moving in the boxes.
Okay. That's good. I think it's better now.
Okay. Well, let me begin. The PowerPoint slide is an overview, which I hope will make it easier for you to think about some of these issues as we progress during the course of the next hour and a half. What we're trying to do is to look at Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, each of whom I would argue were probably the two greatest leaders in the black freedom struggle of the 20th century. But there are many differences between the two, and it's usually those differences that are what people know and think about. And those differences are real, and this is not that for most of their lives, and particularly most of their public lives, and interaction with the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, Dr. King and Malcolm X were on opposite sides of the struggle to gain equal rights and had two different approaches. Clearly, I think what you can see most obviously and what you will see from the documents is the dualistic differences between the two. Integration versus nationalism or black nationalism in this particular instance. The tactic of, well, in King's case, the philosophy of nonviolence versus, and I'm not calling it violence. You can see I haven't written nonviolence versus violence. I've put down here any means necessary, which we'll go into, I think, more specifically later. And the any means necessary is something that often confuses people about Malcolm X and whether he is an advocate of violence. The religion, obviously, is different. Christianity versus Islam, and even with Malcolm, it's actually two different forms of Islam. One he maintained most of his life, and the other just at the very end. With King, we identify redemption. In other words, the sense that America could become different. America could pay for its sins of slavery and racism and heal itself. With Malcolm, the rhetoric certainly speaks more about revenge, more about making white people pay for the sins of racism that they had committed. King, we identify more with consensus, which is related to integration, but trying to establish a support, black, white, rich, poor, for racial equality, as opposed to polarizing the races, where Malcolm tended to speak to black people and express the hostility of black people for the white oppression that they had suffered. In a way, I would call it Martin's emphasis on hope as opposed to Malcolm's perhaps the words that generate fear. In Dr. King, we see, and Martin and Malcolm, we see divisions within the African American community itself. That's one of the fallacies of looking at African American struggles, whether it was in the 1950s and 1960s or 1850s and 1860s, to view African Americans as totally the same. Well, Martin Luther King really comes out of a middle class, black middle class environment that emphasizes respectability, that emphasizes education, discipline, hard work. Whereas Malcolm comes out, as many of you know from having read his autobiography, comes out of a working class background, and ultimately the working class degenerates into poverty as his father is killed and his mother is placed in a mental institution, and he and his siblings are parceled out to the various foster families. And finally, I think a major difference is the rhetorical tone. King often, at least in retrospect, comes off as providing a soothing possibility, addressing toward white people the possibility that they can redeem themselves, that they can make up for the sins of the past. Where Malcolm's tone is much more strident as it relates to white people. King's audience had a message to both that did talk about overcoming the past and creating a new future. Malcolm probably spoke more directly to black people than white people, though, of course, white people listened and were very much afraid of what Malcolm had in mind. So there are real differences between Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. And these differences, incidentally, without getting too involved in it, these differences go back, way back into American and African American history. These are not differences that emerged in the 1950s and 1960s. These differences go back into the 19th century. It's contrasting the goal of integration or assimilation into a larger American culture versus a black separatism, a black nationalism, and rejecting that American culture. You can find this having taken place for 200 years, and Martin and Malcolm were perhaps the latest, most prominent examples of this historical possibility. Now, the similarities between the two are often neglected, if not ignored. And in some ways, I think, because the differences are so obvious, it's the similarities that are more striking and perhaps even more interesting. Now, similarities. The importance of religion. Both of these men considered religion as a primary factor in their lives. Of course, it came later to Malcolm than it did to Martin. Martin was the son of and grandson of Baptist preachers. Malcolm was also the son of a Baptist minister, but that wasn't perhaps the most important aspect of Malcolm's father's background. Perhaps the most important aspect was Malcolm's father's support for the black nationalist philosophy in the 1920s of Marcus Garvey, who Malcolm in many ways resembled. But religion is important, and of course after 1946, when Malcolm is in prison, Islam and the original version that he adhered to, the Nation of Islam, which is different from Orthodox Islam, which Malcolm was later replaced. Both men recognize the structural interconnectedness of racism, poverty, and imperialism. Both realize that what they're fighting is not just individual racial prejudice. They're not just dealing with individuals. They understand that racism is embodied in white supremacy, which has coexisted with the founding of the American colonies in the 17th century, that it is embedded in American history, and that racism and the way it operated is also connected to poverty, an economic subservience that affects African Americans disproportionately in the United States. And finally, they see racism as a correlate and closely connected to imperialism. The idea that Americans are going overseas, whether it starts in the 1890s in Cuba and the Spanish-American War in the Philippines, or through the 20th century in interventions in Central America, and finally in Vietnam, where Americans, like other white nations, are seeking to bring American values and a certain kind of American culture on non-white nations, which unfortunately often results in a great number of deaths through wars that Americans fight. And they both understood this. Both believe in active resistance. Martin Luther King often was referred to as practicing passive resistance. Well, he used that term, and the term comes from Gandhi, but it's a terrible term, and it's caused all sorts of misconceptions. He believes not in passive resistance, but active resistance, putting your body on the line in various forms of civil disobedience. Racism is not to be tolerated. Racism is to be attacked, but in a nonviolent way. Malcolm's an interesting case because Malcolm believes initially in resistance to white oppression, but not politically, because the Nation of Islam did not believe that Muslims, follow their point of view, should become involved in politics. They believe that ultimately Allah would take care of the white devils and resolve the problem. It wasn't until 1963-64 that Malcolm, when he broke away from the Nation of Islam, would take politics and black nationalism and meld them together. Both believe, as I said earlier, in the tenacity of racism. That it's not just an individual measure. That it's not just a function of prejudice. That it's built in to American institutions. That it really reflects what W.E.B. Du Bois called decades earlier white privilege. That is often very difficult for white people and even black people. Both of their goals, and this is, I think, very important, was for freedom of black people. But it was more than freedom in terms of laws and court decisions. It was freedom that would also mean black dignity and black pride. There's no need to reinforce that about Malcolm, because we know a good deal about that. But often, and I hope we can talk about this later, often we forget that Dr. King had no less a belief in black dignity and black pride. And in fact, Dr. King came out of black institutions, of black communities, to a greater extent than Malcolm X did, interestingly. Both believed in the importance of the ballot, but they knew the ballot was not enough. They believed in economic opportunity and development, and ultimately both would question the capitalist system as well. In their leadership styles, they were inspirational, and a particular form of leadership that we call charismatic. In other words, the force of their personalities were generally what they used to mobilize and organize followers. For the most part, they both believed in working through organizations in which they stood at the top, and that is contrasted with various other civil rights groups that we might talk about. Both were targets of government surveillance and repression, both targets of the FBI and the Justice Department. Both, I don't have it on the list, but both foreshadowed their own deaths. Both saw that as prophetic figures. They were likely not to live to ripe old ages. In fact, both died in the late 1930s. In effect, both operated in an environment of sexism. Neither really mobilized within their leadership structure women. Both really had traditional views toward women. I think Martin King's was partly because he was a Baptist preacher, but he was also a child of mid-20th century America and the sexual chauvinism that existed. Some of Malcolm's probably comes out of the kind of structure of the Nation of Islam, which puts women in a particular role that doesn't stress, politics. In context is important. We have to remember who we're talking about. There's the king of the pre and post 1965 years, and some make a big issue of saying that there really are two kings, one before 65 and one after. I think that is true to a large extent, but not absolutely. The same for Malcolm. We have to talk about the Malcolm before the 1950s, and then the Malcolm before 1964, and the Malcolm after 1964. So it's a very complicated question. Just who are interested? Yes.
We have a question that bears upon the point you just raised about the two Martin Luther Kings and the two Malcolm X's. Can you address Malcolm's lack of interest in politics for most of his Nation of Islam membership? See it scroll by. Since you see that as one area of similarity with MLK, so if you could talk a little bit more about the politics and Nation of Islam.
Right, the Nation of Islam was a black nationalist religious group whose ideology is not exactly the same ideology that comes out of the Orthodox Islam of Africa and the Middle East. I'm sure you all can find out more about the Nation of Islam, but strictly speaking, it's different in how Islam emerges. Allah is important in here, but and the Quran is important, but it comes out of a different origin. It's kind of mythology is different from Orthodox Islam. But according to Elijah Muhammad, who was the head of the Nation of Islam, and who thought of himself as the living incarnation of Allah, his word was taken at whatever he said. He said that the Nation of Islam would not get involved in electoral politics, in any sort of secular politics, that it was up to Allah. It was up to Allah and the theology of the Nation of Islam ultimately to bring about the justice that the original advocates of the creators of the Nation of Islam had said, and that was
Steve,
if
I could interrupt for a second. Okay, Steve, if I could interrupt for a second. We lost your sound there for a moment. I really do apologize to everybody for this technological problem. Things did work okay in the run-through. Could you just repeat that point again, please?
Okay. Basically, Elijah Muhammad, who really is the prophet, the living embodiment, really, of Allah, according to the Nation of Islam, not according to Orthodox Muslims. His view, the theology, is that politics is not going to erase the problems faced by African Americans. That in the end, what is going to happen, according to the theology of the Nation of Islam, is that the white devils will be destroyed. The white devils will be removed according to Allah's will. How that will happen is probably complicated, but I don't think we need to go into it. It's just that from a religious point of view, the argument is that that's how all these problems will be resolved. So he was insistent that the Muslims, and that included Malcolm, remain divorced from politics. They didn't campaign, they didn't support candidates, they weren't even going to make comments. One of the reasons Malcolm was expelled from the Nation of Islam, you may remember, because he commented about John F. Kennedy's death, which Elijah Muhammad had specifically prohibited any kind of comments of this, and Malcolm did. By '63, Malcolm had come to understand, and in part, he saw this because of what he saw the civil rights movement and Martin King doing, and that is that to change this, the structure of racism in this country, you had to become politically involved. And what he wanted to do was to engage African Americans more in political resistance as well as religious resistance. And that Malcolm would do when he created in 1964 the Organization of African American Unity. But Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam continued to denounce political involvement. So I hope I've answered that. The good cop versus bad cop, each in a sense, I think, used each other. As we'll see, Martin presented Malcolm, as the embodiment of, the bad. In those days, we might have called him Negro. And if white America didn't listen to Martin, they were going to get all sorts of problems, revolution, rebellion, violence wreaked upon them. And interestingly, Malcolm understood this. And by 1964-65, Malcolm was willing to play the bad cop if it would help Martin Luther King out. Now, finally, think about the myths. King is the dreamer. The white man is Negro. Malcolm is the proponent of aggressive violence. They were irreconcilable opponents. and also that by the end of their lives, they had totally transformed themselves into something quite different. I think all of those need to be modified, and I hope we can do that. So the first order of business, unless you want to ask a question, would be to look at the first set of documents. So I think we can. Richard, is there a question that you want to ask?
Yes, there is. Was good cop, bad cop an organized effort between Martin Luther King and Malcolm?
No, it was not an organized effort. This was not. Remember, they only met once, and they met for a very short time in 1964 when Martin Luther King was in the national capital trying to lobby for the Civil Rights Act of '64. Malcolm tried to engage King in 1963 to attend a conference sponsored by the nation, but King refused. So there was very little contact between the two. And so I don't think you're going to find any stated evidence. I'm suggesting that this was implied, and I think King understood this, and Malcolm understood this. Malcolm told Coretta King in 1965, he told Coretta King at Selma, Alabama, where he had come down to at the invitation of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, a group I'm sure we'll talk about later. He had come down to Selma because King was engaged in demonstrations there for the right to vote, and at that particular point in February, King was in jail, and he had come to Selma to speak to congregations there, black congregations, and he in effect said, "Look, white America, if you don't listen to Dr. King, you're going to have to pay the price, and it's a price you're not going to like." And he told Coretta before he left that you tell Dr. King that if there's anything I can do to make him more credible so that people will listen to him, I will do it. But that's about as close as either one of them ever came to acknowledging the good cop, bad cop.
We have another question. What did Malcolm mean when he said the chickens? I'm sorry. Steve, once again, the sound died. If you could repeat that last point.
The whole point?
Well, just before it was implicit, before the end there.
Okay, I think it was implicit. They never quite said to each other, "Look, I'm the good cop, you're the bad cop." They didn't have much contact with each other. But in '65, Malcolm went to Selma, Alabama, where King was in jail during the voting demonstrations, and Malcolm spoke to the blacks participating and told them, in effect, that that white America better listen to Dr. King. That's their last chance to listen to Dr. King, and otherwise they would pay a price that he was sure they didn't want to pay. And he told Coretta King, Martin's wife, that he would do anything he could to make Martin more credible. And as I said on other occasions, Martin said the same thing. He said, "Look," and one of the documents in here says just that. "Look, if white America doesn't listen to me, they're going to have to deal with the Nation of Islam and groups like that."
Okay. Well, so then we have a participant here who's sort of summed up what you just said. So you would say that Malcolm saw Martin as more of an unacknowledged partner with the unified goal that he would help out in his own way, rather than as an oppositional force, as has been suggested by so many others. So they were implicit partners, in other words.
They were implicit partners, but I think you don't want to exaggerate this. I'm speaking of 1964, 1965. Before that time, Malcolm was merciless in his condemnation of Dr. King and the Civil Rights Movement. He denounced the Civil Rights Movement for what he thought was a destructive policy of nonviolence, of putting women and children at risk within the Civil Rights Movement, particularly in Birmingham. He referred to King and others like him as Uncle Toms. He was fairly brutal in his condemnation of the nonviolent Civil Rights Movement. And in fact, although King doesn't attack Malcolm, in writing, he's kind of hurt I think. He was hurt by Malcolm's comments about him, but that was again before 1964. By 1964, the two, I think, have a greater awareness that operating together, that something approaching, black equality to come about.
And a real quick response here. We have an earlier question. What did Malcolm mean when he said that the chickens have come home to roost? This was a remark he made in connection with the John Kennedy assassination, right?
Right. What he meant, and of course it was exaggerated, I think what it was interpreted at the time by the media in particular was that he was, in effect, praising the assassination of John F. Kennedy, that John F. Kennedy deserved what he got, which is not what he meant. The language was unfortunate, particularly at the time. What he meant was that America is a violent society. America has been treating black people and non-white people, Native Americans, so forth, for 200 years with violence. America, contains a violent heritage, and in leaders like Kennedy and Eisenhower before him, in not getting the federal government, to end the violence against African Americans in the South, in effect, they were reaping the violent heritage. He didn't praise the assassination of Kennedy. He was just saying that this is a product of America's violent society, particularly the kind of violence that African Americans suffered every day.
Okay, we have a number of other questions here too. When Malcolm X criticized the March on Washington, calling it the farce on Washington, was he maintaining the stance of the Nation of Islam at that time?
Yeah, he was, but I think he, in effect, believed that as well. I mean, it was part of not only the nation, it's not the nation's theology at this point, but it's really part of his political view about the limitations, if not the futility, of nonviolence and cooperating with white people. And so I think, yes, it's not only the nation's point of view, but it's Malcolm's point of view, and it is it's consistent with everything that he had said up until that point.
And we have some speculation here about the changes of Martin Luther King as the civil rights movement moved along. He became more aggressive. Do you think that a more aggressive tone contributed in any way to his assassination?
Yeah, I don't think he became more aggressive. I think aggressive is not quite the right word. He was always aggressive in the sense that he and his followers believed in putting their bodies on the line in the South. It was, for all of Malcolm's talk about self-defense and black manhood, it was King who exhibited black manhood by risking, every demonstration that he took part in, death, violence, and intimidation. So I wouldn't call it aggressive. I would call it more militant. I think militant is militant and more radical. And I think there was always elements of King's philosophy, and particularly King's political philosophy. You can go back to 1955 to some of his earliest remarks and comments, publicly anyway. And you will see that King always shares a belief that not just the right to vote, but economic change would have to occur. He's not talking about imperialism so much, because the United States at that point wasn't engaged in a war of imperialism. But he is concerned about Africa, and he is an anti-imperialist in the 1950s when he's supporting the text of these African revolutionaries. So I think there's always an element of these things that we tend to associate with King after 1965 that's there before 65. It's the context that changes after 1965 that allows King to focus more and more on these issues, precisely because these issues have come to the forefront, and many of the successes that he has achieved have turned out not to be successes. So I think he's become more and more discouraged and is willing to embrace new areas of direction. Of course, the Vietnam War is an important element of that, which was not something that King would have thought about in the late 50s and early 60s. So.
We just one more question on this, and then we can move ahead. Two people have asked about Malcolm X's religious conversion and its relationship to his changing views of Martin Luther King.
The actual second, I would call this the second religious conversion. Of course, the first was in prison when he became an Orthodox disciple of Elijah Muhammad. And the second conversion, I think, I would call the trip to Mecca. He engaged on the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, and also traveled around Africa more extensively. And as he says in his autobiography, and in fact you can see this in letters that he wrote at the time, that he discovered that to be a true Muslim, not the black nationalist variety, but to be a true Muslim meant that you can come in any skin color. In fact, he was amazed to see how light-skinned many of those who took part in the Hajj were. And he also began to understand that maybe in the United States, given the structure of the relationship of black and white, that white people had initiated the system of slavery and Jim Crow, but this didn't mean that all whites were devils. He kind of threw away the black nationalization of Islam notion of white devils, and instead focused on the kind of universal ethics of Islam, and also in terms of his economic philosophy, moved away from the kind of black capitalism that Elijah Muhammad was promoting, and began as well to be a critic of, like Martin was in his way, of capitalism and its relationship to imperialism. So that's something, yes, that takes place 64, and it is part, I think, of the reassessment that he's making about his views of Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement.
Okay, good. We've got about 45 minutes left to go, so why don't we move on to the texts?
Okay, let's look at some of the text, and I'm sure it'll generate some more questions, because we have questions at the bottom of each text. And again, looking at your postings, it's clear to me that most of you are not novices to this period, and that's wonderful to have a conversation with people who have actually read a lot of these documents. Most of these documents are fairly standard now. Well, standard to people who care about it, not necessarily to the American public at large. But we asked the question. I think it's very important. How did these folks become who they are? And a variety of ways. And one of the things I think that we have to emphasize in Martin Luther King that is not emphasized enough, and that is the importance of religion. That, at root, Martin Luther King was a Baptist minister. I mean, that was his job. That was his view of life. He came from a long line of Baptist ministers. That was an important factor. But when you look at Stride Toward Freedom, which is basically a chronicle of the Montgomery bus boycott and what King had learned, I think some of the important language, when I talk to students about it, there's some language I think that is important to point out. Some people think of King as the civil rights movement, and there's been a whole lot of work done to demonstrate that the civil rights movement was obviously much broader than Dr. King. There were many men, and particularly women, who were responsible for what happened there. And sometimes I think that people can almost see King as arrogant, that he thought he was the one and only civil rights leader. And I think that's one of the falsehoods about Dr. King. He didn't think that. He never thought that. And that second line, it's like the third line, I neither started the protest nor suggested it. I think says very clearly that this was not a man who one day said, I'm going to create a protest for racial equality in America. He understood that he, in effect, was a vehicle for the protest. On one hand, a vehicle for the political protest that had preceded King before he ever got to Montgomery, a protest led by women in the Women's Political Council in Montgomery, by a labor leader named E.D. Nixon, who was very much involved with the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which was the most prominent African-American labor union in the country, led by A. Philip Randolph. He understood that, in effect, he was the receiver of this. So, and I think he always was very truthful and very self-aware about his role as a leader. Also, he acknowledges the forces behind his particular view. How does he become who he is? Well, the religious aspect, which I think precedes everything else, precedes his education at Morehouse, his education at Crozier, his education in Boston University. It's Christianity and the black interpretation of Christianity, specifically focused on Christ's Sermon on the Mount and also the biblical story of Exodus. I think if you want to know Martin Luther King and where he comes from, you have to locate him within the tradition of black Christianity. And then, of course, from a political perspective, he derived, and he came late to this. I mean, he knew who Gandhi was, and he read about Gandhi, but he really had no experience with the Gandhian method of nonviolence. He really had no experience until 1955. And the bus boycott, and in fact, King was not a very good Gandhian, because when the boycott began, he had a gun in his house. He didn't think there was anything wrong with having a gun in the house, because they would only use it for self-defense. But during the boycott, a number of people from outside who really were Gandhians, who understood Gandhi, the Fellowship of Reconciliation was a Christian organization, a pacifist organization, nonviolent organization. Bayard Rustin, a very influential black leader, a pacifist who would influence King in many ways, both came to Montgomery and, in fact, educated King on what it meant to practice nonviolence. And it was after 1955-56 that King rejected any form of violence, even self-defense, as far as he was concerned. He understood, by the way, that most black people, 90% plus, did not believe in nonviolence as a philosophy. At best, nonviolence could be a tactic for most African Americans, but it wasn't a philosophy, a total commitment. To King, it was a total philosophy, and King understood that individually, people could defend them.
Well, we seem to have lost the audio again, and I really do.
It wasn't against people defending them.
Here we go. I do apologize. I don't think we're losing it exactly. I think we're experiencing a real delay between what Stephen says and what we hear. Steve, we've lost your audio again, and I do apologize for this. Things are going so well here. The discussion is really going extremely well, and then we lose the audio. Steve, if you can hear me, could you send me a text message, please, to the effect that you can hear me, if you can? Well, we seem to have really blown. There we go. Okay, that's not from Steve. That's from Tyler Russ. Good comment, but doesn't answer our question here. Let me see. I will write. Okay.
Hello?
Oh, you're back. Okay, you're back.
With disaster. Am I back? Yes. But now I can't find my page.
No,
okay.
no.
Am I back?
Oh, okay.
Here I am. I'm back.
You're back. You're back. Okay.
What I was saying is,
okay.
King understood nonviolence as a philosophy. He lived nonviolence as a philosophy. But he also understood that individuals might want to defend themselves if they're being attacked by the Ku Klux Klan. His point was, if we're going to engage in political protest within the context of this country, and it's going to have to be nonviolent because we don't have the military forces to defeat in a violent struggle, he insisted that anyone participating in it had to be disciplined. You had to be organized and you had to be disciplined, and that's important. And that takes a lot of power. That takes a lot of control. King wasn't a wimp, you know. King had to exhibit great discipline and great power, and that's quite important. And he learned much of this through the Montgomery bus boycott. So the three elements to summarize were his religious black Christianity, his secular Gandhianism, if you want, the road before him, nonviolence, and also people like Biden, and finally the Montgomery bus boycott. Now, Malcolm had a different trajectory, and you can see that in this document, which of course comes from his autobiography, and you can see that King had a fairly stable background, stable life. He was brought up in a two-family household, lots of aunts and uncles. He brought up within the black church. He experienced discrimination.
Well, we've encountered another delay here in the audio, and I do apologize for this. We wait Steve's audio.
He lived in a black community. Do you hear me now? Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, Steve, this is it's going in and out, but we can just keep plugging ahead here.
Okay, I don't know what to do.
You can't do anything. I don't know what the problem is. So just
okay. Let me keep going, and hopefully you'll catch enough that you can get the questions to me. As I said, Malcolm's background is quite different. Malcolm actually grows up in Omaha, Nebraska, in what effectively is a white society. The institutions, schools, and so forth would be white, and of course, his father dies. He's left with his mother and several siblings, and his mother becomes, during the Great Depression of the 1930s, his mother becomes impoverished, also probably mentally ill, is put in an institution. Malcolm was put into foster care. And the keys here, and so his experiences very early with white people are terribly negative. White people calling his mother crazy. He uses the word crazy. Putting her in an asylum, a foster care system in Michigan. They moved to East Lansing. In Michigan was awful. And the very famous incident that he talks about, and I'm sure most of you have read about, is when he tells his teacher, that his 8th grade teacher wanted to be a lawyer. The man says, what are you crazy? Maybe you can be a carpenter. So I think you can see that their experiences are quite different, and there's an irony in here. King comes out of a black community, and that black community provides kind of nurturing that, in a way, helps protect him against some of the worst forms of economic hardship and racism, while Malcolm grows up in East Lansing, and first Nebraska and East Lansing, in a community that is not as nurturing, in a black, where there's not a significant black community, and he is subject to white institutions that often treat him as less than an equal person. Let's go to the next one.
Okay, we have some questions here. Just a real quick answer. Did Martin Luther King ever discuss the deacons of defense and others who advocated armed resistance to violence being perpetrated against African Americans in the South?
I'm not sure if he actually mentioned the deacons of defense, although he knew in a march he participated in 1966, that famous march that James Emeritus had begun in Mississippi, the march in which Stokely Carmichael first used the phrase Black Power. King knew that members of the deacons were on the outskirts of the march seeking to protect blacks from any violence. King understood it. He did not advocate it. He didn't want it to really be part of his program. Again, he had the same attitude toward the Deacons of Defense as he had toward Malcolm X, as he had toward any of the groups that advocated, self-defense within a political protest situation.
Okay, we have another question here. Did his emphasis on nonviolence prove unworkable after Selma? Is the evidence of this in the eye for an eye approach of Black Power?
Well, that's a good question. Of course, part of the answer is, we'll never know. He used nonviolence in Chicago. Now, when he moved outside the South, the results of that demonstration were certainly mixed, not very good, in part because he was dealing in a different environment, one that did not present the issue of good versus evil very clearly, and bad cop versus nonviolent protesters. Mayor Richard Daley was, in effect, outfoxed him in Chicago, but I don't know that Chicago was a failure of nonviolence. Nonviolence took place in Mississippi during the Emeritus March, and I think it worked to whatever extent it could there. And then finally, nonviolence was going to be used in Washington, D.C., the Poor People's March, which was going to be probably the greatest demonstration of nonviolent civil disobedience, emphasizing civil disobedience and disruption. King was going to take nonviolence to a higher step, which would probably have caused more disruption, and we would have, that the tale would have, been told there whether it was going to work. I don't think King, to the day he died, King, contrary to myth that he was totally transformed and had given up on some of the things he had said earlier, King never gave up on nonviolence. He believed that nonviolence had to work, because in the end, and this is what I think is very important, in the end, and this is what revolutionaries sometimes have problems with, for King, you had to envision a society that had been transformed in which people could live together. You couldn't have a society that was based on violence, in which particular groups came to power through violence and then used violence to maintain their power. And so he always insisted in nonviolence. And my own editorial thinking here is that unfortunately, not just in the United States, but throughout the world, we have not had enough discipline, nonviolence, demonstrations and protests that have taken place.
All right. We have another question here. How did the rural-urban differences in their power bases contribute to their different messages?
Yeah, that is not rural-urban, north-south, I would say,
Okay.
as well. Clearly, King came out of a Southern tradition, a Southern Baptist Christian tradition. Of course, he didn't live in a rural area. King grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, which was one of the major Southern cities. He worked in Montgomery, again a small city, but a city. But most of the people that King was preaching to were people who lived in rural areas, and people who were fairly devout Christians, and who understood the kind of liberationist aspects of Christianity. Malcolm, again, operates in the North, which already has a lot of the civil rights that Southerners don't. And though they have civil rights, Northerners, Black Northerners, have learned, probably earlier than Black Southerners, that just because you have civil rights doesn't necessarily mean you have political, economic, cultural, social power. And he also understood that racism was not just a Southern phenomenon. I mean, King knew that as well, but King concentrated in the South. Malcolm understood that racism was embedded in Northern institutions as well. Malcolm was talking mainly to people living in Black urban ghettos of the North. People who were no poorer than rural Southerners, but people who came from a different tradition. Even though many of them had migrated from the South, they probably were less religious, more secular than those King spoke to. Probably the influence of the Communist Party was greater in places like New York and Detroit. Garveyism had originated in Harlem, in New York, and the Nation of Islam had originated in first Detroit and then Chicago. So yeah, he's speaking to a different group, a group that is far more disillusioned, with far less hope, and who questions whether civil rights will automatically mean true equality.
Okay, and we have a question here about King in Chicago. Why was Mayor Daley so effective and determined in countering King's efforts? Would you say that was basically Daley's the hold of Daley's political machine on Chicago that accounts for his effectiveness?
Yeah, in large part, yes, including having Black people within his political machine.
Right.
Blacks had been elected. You had a Black congressman. The first African American congressman since Reconstruction was elected in Chicago in the 1920s. So you had Blacks in the political machine. But Daley, remember, was a white liberal. Daley had supported the civil rights legislation of the 1950s and 1960s. And in effect, what Daley said was, sure, Martin Luther King is right. We need civil rights. We need to have housing. We need to clean slums. He was not against clearing the slums. He wasn't going to do anything about it. Daley, Chicago, presided over one of the most segregated educational systems in the country, and I still think it may very well be the most segregated educational system in the country. But he didn't use that kind of language that the white segregationists were using. So in effect, he said, Martin, yeah, sure, right. I'm a civil rights man, and he was very effective.
Okay, we're getting a lot of questions, so we'll respond to the questions, and then we'll get back to the text, and we'll get as far into the text as we can in about the 30 minutes remaining to us. Here's a question about nonviolence as a strategy. Aren't nonviolent acts supposed to provoke violent reactions? Isn't nonviolence trying to provoke violence as evidence of the injustice of the opposition?
Yeah, excellent question, and it's a crucial question, and King had to deal with that question, and you need to read the whole letter from Birmingham jail to understand it. Some historians have made a distinction in King's thinking about nonviolence, that really the turning point is not so much Birmingham, but Albany, Georgia in 1961. Because King uses nonviolence in Albany, Georgia in 1961, 1962, basically to desegregate transportational facilities in Albany and also public accommodations in Albany, Georgia. And ultimately, the goals are not fulfilled. And again, he's outmaneuvered because Albany has a police chief, a sheriff of the county, really, who tries to behave in a nonviolent, well, I shouldn't say tries to behave without being brutal. Now, that doesn't mean he's being gentle, but he's not being brutal. And again, tried to do things. King got arrested. The sheriff, Laurie Pritchard, what he was able to do was, in effect, through a black man in the community, they bailed King out of jail because he didn't want King in jail. He understood that would hurt the town because it would attract federal attention to it. During Albany, King believed not so much in nonviolent provocation. He believed in nonviolent redemption. The power of nonviolence will make white people, Christians, take Jesus's words on the Mount literally. They will take those words and they will act accordingly. He thought you could appeal to the higher consciousness of black Christians, of Christians, white Christians. Albany, in effect, showed him that wasn't going to work in and of itself. That this country, particularly the federal government, which of course really had the power to challenge the Southern law enforcement agencies. They were the only ones that actually had the power to do it. His goal became not so much conversion of the local white people who were repressing African Americans. His goal became to convince the larger American public, generally in the North and Washington, D.C., that they had to come to the rescue of black people because black people were being abused. And there was no better way, and this is the age of television, there's no better way to show that abuse by confronting whites peacefully, but knowing that when you confront them, most likely those brutal elements were going to attack blacks, so they were going to be provoked. And of course, he chose a place like Birmingham, Alabama, where Bull Connor, who was the director of public safety, had a long reputation of being vicious and ruling with an iron hand. He knew, I think, pretty much what was going to happen, and that's what he did. Now, his response would be is that they're doing it nonviolently. They're willing. The black folks are willing to suffer. They're willing to go to jail. It's white people who are committing, doing this violence. They're the ones who have to answer for it. I don't know that satisfies people who think that King's at fault for it, but it's mine.
Okay. Well, we have an opportunity to get back into the texts here because one of the participants asks about the ballot or the bullet speech, and was that really what Malcolm X wanted to see happen at that point in his career? I believe that was, what, early 65. Given what you were saying about the recognition by Northern African Americans realizing that civil rights did not necessarily translate into political or economic power. I want to know, we've got some slides from the Battle of the Bullet. You want to move to those?
I could move there, as long as we come back to the letter, because there is something about the letter that I think is important, particularly with people who teach young folks. So
okay,
I'd like to. Can we just deal with the one thing from the letter?
By all means. Yes, by all means. Stay with the letter then.
Stay with this particular part of it, and I think if you look at the part, it is one of the most touching revelations, really, in I think American history. It's one of the most personal public announcements, really, in American history. As you know, ministers and one rabbi in Birmingham told King not to come in. They thought it would provoke violence. They wanted time. They had a new mayor. They wanted a new system of government. They wanted time to see if they could work out their problem. Talks about other people who have said, wait, why won't he wait? Why won't he wait is the question here. Particularly when clergy who might be sympathetic are telling him to wait. And that's what the letter is about. And what he says here, and he's addressing it about children. And here's where I think the whole question, King, as a person who understood that black dignity, black self-respect was a key aspect. Black power, really, is a key aspect of the civil rights movement. And you get it from here because what it does to children, and he explains what it does to a 6-year-old daughter when they ask, why can't they go to Fun Town? Why can't they drink from fountains? Why aren't their elders treated equally when they're not called Mr. or Mrs.? The sense of nobodiness, the psychological trauma, right, is what King is trying to address. And Malcolm did too. Malcolm did it by attacking whites. King did it by trying to demonstrate to white people that this is something that's so horrendous and unchristian that they should do something about it. But the question, and someone raised it today on the forum, about the use of children. And I think that's an interesting question to ask your students. I asked mine, who are a little older than yours, about, I actually say, is it a form of child abuse? For Dr. King, who have supported using 9-year-olds, 10-year-olds, 11-year-olds, 12-year-olds in demonstrations where they might be attacked and, in fact, would get arrested. I think that's an important question. And, you know, part of his answer would be, and this is what you might want to discuss, part of his answer would be is if we don't do it at a young age, if we don't get children to understand their sense of personhood, their sense of somebodiness, right, then we're never going to overcome the racial mental pressure. And this is one of the things at that time where Malcolm did argue that King was, you know, a fool. He used some of his harshest language because for Malcolm, his view was that black manhood depended on protecting women and children. How could you let women and children suffer in this way? Well, that's the real question. That's the real question. I think it generates excellent discussions among students when you frame it at what does this mean really to use children in a protest movement? Where is, you know, the age of consent? Hello?
Yes, we're still here, Steve.
I'm letting that. I'm letting that sort of circulate.
Okay.
You say, I don't know, unless you want to stay with this. Malcolm's response, of course, was from the grassroots, and it was harsh. It's very harsh, and he's not talking about children here, although that offended him greatly.
Well, once again, we seem to have lost the audio. Again, I do apologize for this. This system has worked well, extremely well in the past. I can't account for its problems this evening.
And anyway, okay. Do you hear me now? Can you hear me?
We're back. We're back.
Okay,
go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, you can see with Malcolm, he thinks no revolution can be peaceful. This notion, who has peaceful revolutions? That white people only want black people to think they can have a peaceful revolution. And here he also begins, and this is part of it, is the Nation of Islam philosophy of land. That's what the Nation of Islam preached, that blacks should separate by having their own nation within the nation. They should have land as the basis, and Malcolm is still talking about it. But for Malcolm, this would evolve into a much broader notion than just having land. It would be more of a notion of eradicating capitalism, instituting a kind of revolutionary socialism that was black nationalist based. But why don't we go, you said the ballot and the bullet. Okay?
Okay.
I mean, King's give us the ballot. That was one of his earliest. And that came, the context of that was the second anniversary of Brown versus the Board of Education. The second anniversary. And there was what was called the prayer pilgrimage on Washington, D.C. It only attracted about 10 to 20,000 people. King was not quite the national figure he would be 6 years later, but it was an impressive turnout. And what they were trying to do was not just commemorate Brown, which of course had not been fully implemented, but also to pressure the federal government into taking action to get congressional legislation that would make Brown more effective and also get the right to vote in the South, where most blacks in 1957 could vote. And basically, those are his reasons. You know, once blacks get the right to vote, all of these things will happen. The Southern Manifesto he's referring to was a congressional document signed by 101 congressmen and senators from the South in 1956, where they said they're going to take any means legal to prevent Brown versus the Board of Education. That's what they attempted to do. In effect, they claimed they were going to nullify Brown versus the Board of Education, which of course they couldn't do, but a lot of rhetoric in that. And what King was saying, well, if black people can vote in the South, remember black people are somewhere of about, depending on what state, but maybe 30% of the Southern electorate. If black people could vote, they're going to be able to elect people who are going to respond to their wishes. Now, Malcolm's response is interesting because in some ways, Malcolm was not incorrect here. In some ways, they're both right, but King perhaps was a bit naive because Malcolm claims, okay, well, you're saying that black people will be able to vote, but how are they going to use the vote? They're going to vote for the Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party is the party of racial segregation in the South. It's the party of Jim Eastland in Mississippi. It's the party of George Wallace in Alabama. This is the Democratic Party. What good is it going to be to vote for the Democratic Party? Now, I think, like much of what Malcolm said, it was so absolute that it doesn't allow for nuances here, because he's attacking Lyndon Johnson here. Associating Johnson, with the worst of Southern segregation, which is not correct. In fact, Johnson was one of the few Southern senators who didn't sign the Southern Manifesto. And of course, Johnson would be responsible for the major civil rights legislation. But he is right, Malcolm is, in that the right to vote does not automatically bring black people power. They'll get more power. They'll improve their lives with it. But power is more complicated in America than just having the right to vote. And of course, what neither of them foreshadowed, what neither of them knew, was that once blacks got the right to vote in the South would flip from the Democratic Party, white Southerners would flip from the Democratic Party and become the foundation of the Republican Party, a party that would attempt in many ways to limit most of the gains of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society and the Civil Rights Movement.
Steve, we have a question here. Would you say that Malcolm's ballot or the bullet is a rhetorical ultimatum?
I'm not sure what is meant by I think a lot of what Malcolm says is rhetorical ultimatum. I think Malcolm is one of the great rhetoricians, as is Martin. But Malcolm is coming from a different, tradition than Martin. Malcolm is telling America it's this or else. I mean, this is what you've got to do, and we don't have any hope for you. We don't have any hope for you. I don't know if the ballot or the bullet part of it. Yes, in that sense, it's an ultimatum. But that's pretty much what he had indicated for most of his, most of his life with the Nation of Islam. But he's saying this is your last chance. This is part of his transformation. You can see this, even though it's pretty harsh. It's part of the transformation. The ballot is fine. We'll support the ballot. He has questions about how far the ballot will take them. But what he's saying to America, and King was saying much the same in 1964, that he wasn't going to use the bullet. King was saying this, you either got to do this nonviolently, peacefully through the system, or you're going to face a Holocaust out there. So yeah, I think it is a rhetorical ultimatum.
And following up on that question, do you think Malcolm X thought that it would ever really come to that point that that bullets would start flying throughout the country?
Well, he saw it. The country did see bullets fly, mainly in a lot of the bullets were aimed at black people. But if you want to look at the riots or rebellions, whatever you want to call them, of 64, 65, every summer from 64 through 68. And even beyond, you saw violence in mostly northern cities, but you had it in southern cities as well. Clearly, this violence reflected a loss of faith that white America was going to live up to its promises. I mean, King understood this. King talked about his dream his American dream turning into an American nightmare. He understood this. But King still had hope. As much as it was diminishing, King still had hope. I think Malcolm certainly would have used political system in ways to bring about change. But it's not clear exactly where that was and how that was played out.
Okay, we have just a few minutes left, Steve. Shall we move on then to the next text?
Let's see. Next text. I keep getting this 34. Okay. Here's the question about, and again, it goes to King. This is text 34, the ethical demands of integration. And I think this is a common misunderstanding about the terms we use, or the terms we think people understand. Words like segregation, desegregation, integration. And here's where I think King was a revolutionary, at least rhetorically, but I think more than that. For him, and I think Malcolm would agree with his definition of segregation. Malcolm is interesting on this too. Segregation represents a system that is prohibited. It denies the Negro equal access to schools, parks, restaurants, libraries, and the like. Segregation is apartheid, is a racial apartheid. We call it that in South Africa. We really need to call that in the United States as well. It's the use of law, the use of force to not just keep blacks separate, but to keep blacks suppressed and to preserve white supremacy. That's what racial segregation is in America. Now, Malcolm agrees in one of these documents. He points out that segregation is what he's opposed to. Separation isn't bad. Separation means that people themselves have their own institutions, but they control it. King wouldn't necessarily disagree with that. He would call it racial pluralism, as others would. Now, what most people think that King was talking about was desegregation. And King points out that desegregation is really a halfway measure. All it does is take away the negatives. It removes legal prohibitions. It's a half step. The full step, and again, I think in America, and most of world history, this is a radical notion. Integration is something that I don't know that we've ever experienced it. He says it's creative, more profound, and far-reaching. It's not just accepting desegregation and welcoming blacks into, the total range of human activities, but it's really dealing with other people as human beings. It's creating a community. He called it a beloved community. It's creating a community in which human beings have respect for each other's worth, regardless of what their race, religion, and that's not happened in America. It probably is not going to happen in my lifetime. And it's not just tolerance. He's going beyond tolerance. He's really talking about a way of life. And I think that's profoundly radical in America, just as I think nonviolence is profoundly radical in America. What I think isn't radical in America is violence, because we use violence all the time, both at home and abroad. So this is where I see King as a true revolutionary, even though his words are moderate, words are soothing. But the idea here is really transformative and something that will take still a lot of power. And again, this is Malcolm. You can see that he's talking about segregation as something that is imposed upon black people, whereas separation, which he doesn't see any harm in, and in fact separation is something that we have had in this country through the experiences of immigrants and so forth, that separation, it means controlling your own destiny, is accepting who you are and being thankful for who you are. Do you want to deal with some questions? I know we're running toward the end of time.
Yeah, we're about to run out of time. We've got about 3 minutes left, but we've got some questions here that I think are good questions to end with. Who today in 2011 would be the inheritors of the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., and who would be the inheritors of the legacy of Malcolm X among African American leadership today, in your estimation?
Yeah. As a legacy, probably, the person who's most identifiable, who comes out of the same movement that King came out of course, is Jesse Jackson, who also embraced, in the course of his career, some of Malcolm. But probably the person who thinks more like Malcolm, or at least is treated more like Malcolm, is probably, I saw it on the chat thing, Al Sharpton, I suppose. Louis Farrakhan perhaps used to be thought of in some ways, although Farrakhan remained an orthodox black Muslim, where Malcolm did not. But Louis Farrakhan never really had the kind of breadth of power that Malcolm did. Part of it is that some of the possibilities have moved into one of the ironies. Both Martin and Malcolm made it possible for black people to come into the political arena, and so they become part of the system. Barack Obama likes to, in some ways, see himself as both the legacy of Martin and Malcolm. I wish he was a little more of the legacy of the 1965 Malcolm 68 Martin, but that's a different story.
And we have another point here. Another participant asked, what of Cornel West? Where would he fit into this tradition?
Yeah. Well, again, Chris Cornel West doesn't lead, for the most part, mass protests, and Cornel West is both a professor, an academic, an intellectual, like Martin was, a formal intellectual. His ideas embrace. I think his ideas run right in the same vein as King's ideas circa 1968, And I think he would accept a good deal of what Malcolm said in 1965. But I see King and more, I see Cornel West more in the tradition of Martin Luther King at his death.
Mm-hmm.
You know, most black leaders in some ways are the children of Martin and Malcolm, in large part because each one of these folks has been part of a longer African-American tradition. King was a philosopher, and he liked to talk about Hegel's dialectic. And I think he's absolutely right. Change comes from an interaction of the positive, negative, yeses and nos, either and ors, to create something that combines both, to create something new that combines both. And in effect, people within the black community today who speak out on issues share both of what the later Martins and Malcolms believe.
Okay, well, ladies and gentlemen, I think on that point we should bring things to a close here. We have reached the end of our time. I hope we have addressed all of your questions. If we haven't, we'll have to save them for another day. If you do have some further points you'd like to make, please use the forum to continue the discussion and to ask your questions. We will monitor the forum until March 4th, and we'll post responses to your questions and comments there. Please submit your evaluations to us. I want to thank all of you for your participation and for your patience in putting up with the technological problems we were experiencing. And I want to thank Steve for also putting up with those technological problems and giving us a really excellent and insightful presentation this evening. So, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to wrap things up. I want to thank you all for participating. I hope you'll be with us again. To escape, as you know, go up to the upper left-hand corner of your screen, click File. There'll be a drop-down menu. Click on that, and you're home free. Thank you very much, and I hope you'll join us again for another seminar.